So one way to think about this is that you're making an argument that gurdwaras or sites related to Guru Nanak in Pakistan should be preserved, maybe for their own sake, world heritage, right? Or you could frame it that they should be preserved for the global Sikh community and like as an amanat that, is something entrusted to the people currently in that region, that they must maintain it for Sikhs. But another way you can think of it is that they should be preserved and maintained and remembered for today's Pakistanis, whatever their religious background. So I think I know how you're going to answer, but how would you answer that? Which of those is the reason to preserve these things?
So I think I'm going to answer that question with reference to what is happening at Kartarpur Sahib. It's a great initiative, the whole Kartarpur Sahib corridor. I think there is no other figure who can bring together Indians and Pakistanis or different religious communities better. There is no better symbol of this rapprochement than Guru Nanak himself. And Kartarpur Sahib corridor, right on the border of India-Pakistan, really has that potential to become a very, very strong symbol. And so, of course, I'm sure many of you saw what happened, and Imran Khan made a speech about how this is the Makkah for Sikhs. And well, I kind of disagree with that idea. I mean, I think so. Kartarpur Sahib is. So it's, of course, I don't think it is any favor that the Pakistani government is doing to the Sikh community. I mean, the whole idea of seeing Kartarpur Sahib or the whole idea of seeing Guru Nanak as a Sikh, as only who's somebody respected and loved by the Sikh community, I think is very, very problematic. So in fact, I've done a story on this that much before the whole Kartarpur corridor issue happened, and much before the Kartarpur corridor the Kartarpur Gurdwara was actually renovated. And so, I mean, being on the border, at one point, the Gurdwara, of course, was in shambles, it was in ruins, and there were many drug smugglers and smugglers from across the border and this site who were kind of based at the Kartarpur. So it was actually kind of, it became a Gurdwara much later. And there were still a few local Muslim communities who had heard stories of Guru Nanak from their ancestors and their forefathers, who used to keep on going to the Gurdwara. So in some way, they were keeping alive the memory of Guru Nanak, and they were keeping alive the sanctity of Kartarpur Sahib, and there was nobody else. When the Pakistani government had no interest. And of course, the whole conversation had not happened. And today what is happening is that we are talking about the renovation of Kartarpur Sahib, which is great. And of course, the Sikh community all over the world needs to have access to Kartarpur Sahib, which is great, and it will happen, hopefully. But the access should also remain open to others who are not Sikhs, but who are Muslims and who still love and who still respect Guru Nanak. And unfortunately, I feel like that, because that is what is happening in many Gurdwaras that are being renovated. That in the name of security, it only remains then open to either Hindu or Sikh pilgrims who come from across the border. But there are many people who I know who would love to go to Nankana Sahib and pay their homage to Guru Nanak from Pakistan. There are many Muslims. And that's the idea that we are not doing, not we, but the Pakistan government, for example, is not doing any favor to the Sikh community. It is actually doing a favor for itself. It needs to come to terms to understand that the Gurdwara or Guru Nanak or Kartarpur Sahib is not just a heritage for Sikh community. It is Pakistan's heritage. It is Punjab's heritage. It is the syncretic heritage of India and Pakistan. Yeah.
Very, very well put. Thank you. So there's an interesting tension in this book where the author starts out looking for ghosts, right? Something that's been forgotten, coming from where you were coming from. This was, as you said, something forgotten. But then when you go to these places, you find that it's still living, because there are communities tending to some of these gurdwaras. Some of the work of your mentor had already triggered some renewal and revival in those areas. So you start out looking for ghosts, and then you find there's not a ghost. It's something still alive and almost alive and well, but at least living. And then what emerges is that it's a question of locality, and it's a question of class. So you talk several times in the book about coming from a certain Pakistani Punjabi elite. That's the word that you use. And the way that elite in Pakistan has become somewhat disconnected from their Punjabi identity, especially Punjabi language. and where it's actually discouraged to speak in Punjabi. English is best, then Urdu, and then, as little as possible Punjabi. And then you find on this journey that actually many other people are, outside of that class and that kind of urban elite class. That culture is alive and well out there. So would you call writing this book a kind of redemptive act, an effort to redeem a lost past, specifically for a certain class of people in Pakistan? Do you think writing a book, especially a book, this is in English, for that class, right? Can a book do that? And in what ways is this a book about class, or a class that has sort of lost its sense of who and what it is, rather than just a book about national identity or religious identity? Is this a book actually about a class, an elite class?
I think it's a great question, and it's a slightly difficult question to answer, but I'm going to attempt it anyway. So I think in my writing, I do mention consciously, as you pointed out, that I belong to a certain geographical location and I belong to a certain class, and I approach wherever I'm going from my own privilege. And sometimes you're absolutely shocked. So, for example, Anand's done a lot of work on this as well. That we usually, so the conventional understanding is that the more educated you are, the more tolerant you are, and the less educated you are and the less tolerant you are. And we think of extremism and think of violence as something that only the uneducated people do, which is absolutely not true. I mean, the unfortunate incident, for example, that happened recently in Sri Lanka, and one of the masterminds behind that was somebody who had graduated from LSE. And it's actually not a very simple link between education and tolerance. I feel like, especially in India, Pakistan, I'm not sure about Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, for example, but in the India-Pakistan context, for example, I feel like at some level, our education system is very, very problematic. Our education system is promoting a particular understanding of history, and it is promoting a particular agenda. For example, in Pakistan, the very course Pakistan Studies, for example, the agenda behind that course is to promote a particular understanding of who a Pakistani is. And of course, whoever is a Pakistani is somebody who's, well, firstly, a Muslim, but a particular kind of Muslim. So he has to be a Sunni Muslim, and it has to be a he. Of course, she is not really part of the national identity, and of course, he has to be a Punjabi. And even if we go to more detail, he has to be from central Punjab, from a very particular. So South Punjab is kind of marginalized, and in fact, that's where the irony or the contradiction of the country's identity also exists. Because whereas on one hand, Punjab is so powerful, Punjab is the economic hub of the country, Punjab is the economic political engine behind the country. So the bureaucracy, the army, the politicians, even now the journalists all come from Punjab. But so on one hand, Punjab is very powerful, but Punjab also is perhaps culturally the most marginalized area in Pakistan, where in a very simple way of putting it is that to become more Pakistanis, to become the symbol of what Pakistan is, Punjabis had to give up Punjabi. They had to give up the Punjabi identity, right? So the assumption is that you can only wear one identity. You cannot have two identities at the same time, and that's a very weird nationalistic way of how many nations see that if you are a Punjabi, somehow you're not a good enough Pakistani. Pehle aap Pakistani bane, phir aap Punjabi bane. And that whole narrative is very, very problematic. I feel like you have the potential to have multiple identities at the same time. So there are many. So Punjabi, for example, is actively discouraged in school. Recently, there was a huge hue and cry about this incident where one of the largest schools in Pakistan, a private organization, the principal of the school had a circular which said that foul language is not allowed in the school, and the example that he gave of foul language is of Punjabi and of course curse words. So the idea that Punjabi is almost seen as a curse, as a language of just curses, it's seen as a vulgar language. And of course the idea is that you completely forget how Punjabi is also the language of Guru Nanak, how Punjabi is also the language of Waris Shah, and how Punjabi is also the language of Bulleh Shah and Shah Hussain and Guru Arjan. Right? So the whole so young children, for example, in Pakistan, especially the educated, grow up without any understanding of who these people are. For example, at a very young age, I was taught Shakespeare, it's great that I should learn as much literature as possible. So it's really okay for me to learn Shakespeare or Yeats or whoever, but the idea is that should not come at the cost of me not learning about Bulleh Shah and me not learning about Guru Nanak. So they have to work together. And I think what really happens because of this education system is that the more educated you get, the more divorced you get from your own identity, of your own culture, right? So then there's a very weird kind of contradiction that exists, that the more so there's also a cultural difference between those who are educated, those who are elite, and those who are not, right? And in some ways this culture then, for example, so that this culture stays alive in those uneducated rural areas, and in many ways you will see stories of tolerance much more. So for example, there's one story that I documented in the book is at Gurdwara Sacha Khand, which is close to Gurdwara Sacha Sauda, and that Gurdwara today has become, so basically a Sufi saint in the 90s came and settled at that Gurdwara. And he was very aware, by the way, that's how I interpret it and understand it. He was very aware of the Sikh heritage of that Gurdwara, and in fact he came and settled there because he thought this was a sacred place. And his followers, whereas on one hand do respect that Gurdwara as a shrine, but also respect the Gurdwara. So sitting there, for example, I was interviewing these people about what the Gurdwara is, what do you think it represents, and one person who was, well, I mean, who in his conversation did not really seem like somebody who had a lot of formal education, tells me the entire story of the Gurdwara. He tells me the entire story of Sacha Sauda. Now, I had to go through 16 or 17 years of education and still never learned about Guru Nanak's story. But here was this man who perhaps did not have as much formal education as I did, still knowing about Guru Nanak's story. And I asked him, how have you learned about the story? And he told me how his ancestors had told him about Guru Nanak because they had lived with the Sikhs at one point. And of course, I feel like if that person had been given formal education, his idea of Guru Nanak would have been formed by the Sikh aspect of, which is not really part of the Pakistani identity.
I think there are some interesting parallels in the way Hindu Punjabis have dealt with their Punjabi identity on the other side of the border. Yes. So let's switch gears a little and talk about the nature of the travel. So you did not travel alone. You traveled with Iqbal Kaisar, who you take as your beloved, I would say, guru and mentor. And you talk about that relationship in like Murshid Murid. In the Sufi tradition, you can think of Guru Chela, Guru Shishya, Guru Sikh, right? And there's an analogy you draw between this travel, between you and your mentor, and the way Nanak traveled with Bhai Mardana in his time. He also did not travel alone. And you mentioned that this is sort of a sort of dying form of education, that intimate bond between a guru and the student. And it touched me because I realized that when I did my PhD with Tom Lacour at UC Berkeley, he comes from a German Jewish tradition, and he said, Priya, I think of myself as your Doktorvater. That's a German word, meaning the father of your doctorate. So it was this, and he used to give me blessings all the time. And it felt very much sort of a similar tradition. So, but he explained it as something, I think it was an outlier relationship, but I think part of the reason if I've had success academically, it's because I had the security of that bond, right? So it is something to be treasured, that kind of bond. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that bond and then what you feel is lost. Do you think that tradition is actually disappearing? And what is lost with that? Or do you think it's still there, but perhaps nestled in particular areas of learning, like maybe music or religion or things like that? Or are there, what are your thoughts on that kind of mentorship bond and what it can do for a growing mind? And I hope my children are listening.
So I think, so one thing that I'm once again very aware about talking about Guru Nanak. So I mean, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's actually a fictionalized version of what Guru Nanak's life would have been. So the popular stories that we've all heard about Guru Nanak, about Sacha Sauda, or about him confronting Malik Bhago, or even Babur, for example. So I've tried to fictionalize those stories and try to understand, perhaps in my own understanding of what really must have happened. But so whereas I was trying to do that, I was also very aware of the fact that I did not want to project this image that I think that this is the objective image of who Guru Nanak is, right? So I was, for example, very aware of the idea that this is how I understand Guru Nanak. This is a very, very subjective understanding of Guru Nanak. And then I started thinking about where is that subjective understanding of Guru Nanak coming from, and it turns out, of course, that is coming from my mentor, right? So it's coming from Iqbal Kaisar, in that sense, that I could visualize, for example, Guru Nanak, and I'm not a very spiritual person, but for some reason Guru Nanak kind of had that impact on me that I could almost, wherever I would go, those historical places that we talk about, I could almost see Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana at those places by touching those rocks, by touching those stones. It was actually a very, very spiritual experience for me, which also quite interesting because I'm not a very spiritual person to begin with. But somehow it was almost like a spiritual experience. So the idea was that I was very aware of the fact that my understanding of Guru Nanak is a very, very subjective understanding of Guru Nanak, and nowhere did I want to make that claim that I think this is really what happened. I'm very aware of the idea that this is how I think must have happened, and everybody has their own interpretation, everybody has their own image of who Guru Nanak is, or who, let's say, and what is the concept of God. And I think that is the idea that I wanted to explore more. In fact, so I wanted to actually lay down my biases and lay down my vantage point as clearly, and hence I think I drew those parallels. So if you read the book and so you can actually see where my understanding is coming from. A lot of times, for example, they're perhaps, I feel like they're almost like clues in the book. So how you can see how chapter 4, for example, I'm just saying it out loudly. So I'm just saying I'm not really sure about the chapter, but let's say how in chapter 4 there is a clue on how chapter 1 could have been written. So the idea that every fictionalized section is kind of what I experienced and I put it back. So I'm really imposing my own reality. So I'm very aware of the fact. So that kind of answers your first question. The second one, absolutely. I think what happened with the modern education system, which is the colonial British education system that we follow in India and Pakistan, is that kind of, so firstly, it completely ignored, it completely replaced the indigenous education system, which I feel, of course, more research needs to happen on what that system was like, what were some of the drawbacks, and what were some of the strengths of that indigenous education system, because we did have a indigenous Punjabi education system before the British, but that's not the image that the British give, right? That's not how colonial. So the idea is that everybody was a jahil, everybody was uneducated before the British arrived, and we educated this illiterate community, and that's the idea. But there was a very strong tradition of learning, and it was very, especially at higher levels, there was this one-to-one learning, and I feel like maybe at PhD, that is perhaps the idea, to have those one-on-one kind of those relationships and have those intimate relationships. So I think Western scholarship is trying to preserve it. I don't know, maybe you can talk more about the strengths or the weaknesses of if it's actually working. But I feel like, yes, that model of mentorship, that model of having a one-on-one disciple is a very, very strong model that needs to be explored more in our local education system. But having said that, I would not like to romanticize the idea and say it was the great system and we need to kind of develop. I'm sure, I think at some level, and I know in many Sufi dargahs, for example, you still have that kind of relationship, but I can see a lot of problems in that relationship as well, where it almost becomes a very one-way kind of a relationship where only the master knows what is right and the student can never really challenge what the master says. And so, that's not my relationship with Iqbal Kaisar, for example. I disagree with him on many things, and I talk about those things in the book. I disagree with his politics. I disagree with many of the things of how he interprets history, but that does not mean that I cannot learn from him and he cannot. So it's actually a very two-way process. And I think even Guru Nanak's relationship with Bhai Mardana, in that sense, was very, very dynamic. My thesis is that Bhai Mardana, coming from a Muslim Mirasi family, was very, very educated in the musical traditions. And of course, Guru Nanak being a Bedi and an upper caste Hindu, the family must have looked down upon this tradition of performing music, the idea that only the lower castes perform music. But Nanak, of course, in Guru Nanak's message and his philosophy, music plays a very, very important role. And I feel like somewhere Bhai Mardana must have played a very, very important role in talking about, or in perhaps almost teaching Guru Nanak about music. And I think that's where it kind of comes into institutional religion.
Yes, and I want to add two things. One thing you mentioned, there's a real potential to write something like this and then really get nostalgic and romanticize the pre-colonial past or even pre-partition past. And I must say that you don't do that. You're very sensitive. I mean, it's clear that what Nanak is doing, he's doing partly because there is conflict between different religious groups, and he's trying to find another way forward. So there's it's not like it was all roses before, but there is a sense that, when change happens, some things are lost that should not have been lost, and those ones we should go back and find again and recover. And there's a beautiful line, a really strange moment at the end of the book where so this book, the chapters the way it's put together is actually very innovative, and part of the beauty of the book is that there are chapters that are pure legend. There are chapters that are pure history, where you go through each of the gurus in reverse order. So the book is all about Nanak, but it's interspersed with individual chapters on the gurus moving from Guru Gobind Singh back in time towards Nanak. So the whole experience of time in the book is very interesting. Sometimes you're in the present with Haroon, sometimes you're in the past with Guru Nanak, and sometimes you're in these other historical moments. And in between, there's fiction, there's mythology and legends, and there's poetry, mostly of Guru Nanak, but also Baba Farid and others. So there's sort of a melding of genres, and sometimes you're in a story, and then another story starts in there. So you have this feeling of, Arabian Nights or Mahabharata, and that kind of South Asian way of storytelling. And I think it's very, very effective to have organized the book that way. We have just a few more minutes of our conversation, so I want to ask you a question about that, and then maybe seeing time, one or two more questions, and then someone has passed me a question. We will get to your questions soon after that. Just bear with us a few more minutes. So if you could just say a little bit about how you chose this technique of mixing different kinds of writing, and what was the effect you were going for, and what was the purpose and meaning of doing that for you?
So I think the idea of the book is something that I've worked on for a long time. So the book writing itself did not take that long. So it must have been 6, 7, 8 months. But conceptualizing what or how I wanted to write the book is what took much longer. So I think one idea, for example, about the book came from my own lack of knowledge about, firstly, Guru Nanak, but also about Sikhism, about what really the religion is. So when I was, let's say, in college, I wanted to read 10 books and on all the Sikh gurus, and unfortunately I could not find those books in Pakistani libraries and in your bookstores. And the idea was to kind of perhaps write a book that I wanted to read myself, which I could not really read. So the idea of the book actually is perhaps a culmination or a cumulative effort of 3 books that I wanted to write. So I wanted to write a book on Nanak's Gurdwaras, or on historical Sikh Gurdwaras that are in Pakistan, and what is their condition and how are they interpreted in a Muslim environment. Are they preserved? If they are preserved, in what state are they? And does the local community, how does that treat those Gurdwaras? So that was one book that I wanted to do. The second book was about Guru Nanak, that how the fictionalized version of Guru Nanak's life, perhaps what must have happened in real life, and how do those that hagiography develop around Guru Nanak. So that was the second book that I wanted to do. And the third book that I wanted to do was how did Nanak's message eventually became institutionalized religion? Because as far as I understand, Nanak's movement, to me, Nanak's religious his philosophy, his message almost seemed like he wanted to dilute religious identities. He keeps on saying there is no Hindu, there is no Muslim, and if you are a Muslim, become a good Muslim. If you are a Hindu, become a good Hindu. So it feels like Guru Nanak is somebody who wants to dilute these identities and bring different communities together. And how did a new institutionalized religion begin from Guru Nanak? So I wanted to also understand what happened in history, what forced the Sikh gurus to form a separate identity, and I wanted to explore that Mughal conflict between this. So it's almost like 3 books. And then I kind of experimented with the idea that why shouldn't I combine these 3 books and kind of try to make one book. I was very nervous. I mean, of course, it is a lot of genres that I'm trying to experiment, and I was very scared it might work, it might not work. I went through periods. Thank you. I went through periods where I had anxiety, where I couldn't sleep, where I panicked, and I called my editor. I'm like, listen, I don't think this book is going to work. Let's just do some other book. Anyway, so that happened, and I'm glad it kind of came together and received the kind of appreciation that it did. Yeah, so I think that's how it developed.
Is it different when, so there's this analogy between your journey and you're in the footsteps of Nanak, but there's some things that are very different when you're not walking. There's a, and you're going home in between. Guru Nanak was gone for 24 years, right? So Haroon and his companion are in and out and in cars. And you're walking with the purpose that I'm going to write something. Yeah. And this is not why Guru Nanak walked, right? So in a way, you're emulating him, but you're doing something very, very different. So talk a little bit about, does the meaning of the journey change when you're doing it with the idea that I'm going to write this book for these political and pedagogical purposes? That's one question. And related to that, how does the journey impact you then compared to how Guru Nanak's journey, I mean, not to create a comparison that way, but given the difference in purpose, what does it mean to go to the same places with such a different purpose?
Yeah, I think this, once again, it's a great question. I did talk briefly about this in the book, and yeah, I would love the opportunity to talk about this more. So in many ways, I think Guru Nanak's journey was completely remarkable, and we don't talk enough about how he traveled and how much he traveled. We talk about Marco Polo, we talk about even Ibn Battuta, but what Guru Nanak did as a traveler is also something remarkable. To travel such almost the known world at that point, and primarily on foot, is something remarkable that Guru Nanak achieved. He traveled for about 24 years. Yeah, so about slightly more than 2 decades. And I think, and today we've actually lost that art of travel. I don't think we are even possible. It's actually not physically possible to do that kind of travel that Guru Nanak did on foot. And I was thinking about this. So for example, I was in Bhavalpur, which is in South Punjab, and they speak Saraiki. And of course, I come from a belt. My ancestors come from Sargodha, and Saraiki is also spoken there, but it's a very different dialect of Saraiki. So even though I cannot really speak that language that well, I can still understand it. And I was in Bhavalpur, they were speaking the same language, and I couldn't understand it at all. It almost felt like a new language. And I started visualizing or imagining that, let's say, if you're traveling on foot, it almost takes every 10 kilometers, for example, or 20 kilometers, the dialect starts to change. And if you're traveling on foot, so every day you will learn a few new words. And by the time, if I had traveled on foot, by the time I get to Bhavalpur, I would have been very familiar with what the language is. And perhaps how it must have been for Guru Nanak. And in fact, that's the reason why so many new words were included. That's why Punjabi language became so rich under Guru Nanak, because he was so widely traveled. So that was the idea. I think there's also, I feel like, once again, it's not my own interpretation, I feel like there must have been some purpose. So Guru Nanak did not randomly choose places. I think there must have been some conscious decision. I think he was actively looking out for important religious pilgrimages. He did, and he goes to all prominent pilgrimages. And I think that was part of his agenda as well, of his travel. So I don't think it was as vague. But of course, it's
Did you feel you were on a pilgrimage?
Once again, I don't come from a very religious background, and I would have not, at least at the start of the journey, described it as a pilgrimage, but I think it kind of became almost like a pilgrimage to me. So in fact, I was talking to I was joking with my mother-in-law the other day. So the idea that, one of my brother-in-laws went for Hajj, and she was very happy. She's like, so somebody from my family has gone to Hajj, and I'm like, well, I've been to Nankana Sahib. I know that doesn't really count, but so the idea was that it almost became like a pilgrimage where I could imagine, visualize Guru Nanak, and I haven't really had that kind of experience to begin with. I think the only other person, so there's actually two other people who've had a very similar impact on me, is Gandhi. So I went to his home in Bombay, for example, and I could also imagine, because I've read so much about him, I was so inspired by him at one point, so I could almost imagine him sitting there and talking to him. And the other person who had a very similar impact on me is Bhagat Singh. So I went to his home in Faisalabad and the place where he was executed and assassinated, the Lahore jail where he was. So these three figures almost had this kind of spiritual experience for me. And I think in a way, I mean, I don't know, it's very hard to explain or put or even understand for myself if I have transformed in the journey. I mean, there is some sort of transformation. I can't put my finger on it and be like, that's what it is. I don't know, but I feel like, yes, it was a very transformative journey. It was, yeah, I mean, it was a great experience.
Thank you.